Hello all, thanks for joining us today. This is James Crafassi over at Red Zone, and we're going to talk about all of the fallout from the wonderful COVID-19 issues. So I think we still have a couple more people hopping on, so I'm going to pause for another minute here, and then we'll jump into our V minus 3 weeks and what's the fun we're finding with people working from home and all the great security stuff that's happening now. Okay. So in the news, uh, these are some cool things that we found over on Forbes that we actually saw some in the wild examples of over the last week, so we wanted to bring them back up. What's interesting is one of these is related to social media, doing the ransomware campaigns, but then the other for the Windows 10 warning is able to be used for automated attacks. So with both of these, there's not really a Microsoft patch out yet for them. So everything's going to rely on the use of something such as Next-Gen Antivirus or OpenDNS, because a lot of these are basically dropping executables that are not being copied to the machine, running only in memory, and really taking advantage of the fear around coronavirus. So what we're really seeing here is a good mix and match of just plain old scripts trolling the internet, and then as well as social media based personal attempts to give people a malware. There was a time when people said that the bad guys were going to pause on doing ransomware because of the coronavirus. They've apparently changed their mind, and there's a big uptick going on with ransomware right now. Another example that we run into, and this is related to the increase in the ACH wire transfer fraud style. And what I mean by that is this is actually something that was very common back in December, especially for small companies, associations, charities, things along those lines. That is now escalating quite a bit more. And we're seeing companies as small as 11 people, as large as 2,000 employees. They're all being hit by this. In the last 2 weeks, we really talked about ACH wire transfer fraud and the fact that with everybody being distributed, bad guys are really taking advantage of that. And here's another example of how they are. This was something we pulled from CyberWire, where basically in the dark web, they are selling an automated spell check that is turning the traditional horrible spam that was really easy to identify, and it's actually making it contextually aware, it's making it grammatically correct, and absolutely passing the sniff test in terms of things that might be valid. And so what's scary about this is it means these attacks can come from anywhere, they can go anywhere, they can appear to be quite correct. With the automation involved, they can check social media and make it contextually aware, meaning it can comment about you personally without a human being involved. And so basically, what they've done is remove the entire human element requirement from this. Basically, that means that any compromised machine or any machine with a Trojan or just machines that are being spun up in China or France or one of the other predominant locations for bad guys, they can actually just spin up these automated servers that just crawl the internet and try to find someone who's going to answer their phishing attack. And there really doesn't have to be a human interaction involved, and so that means there's a high degree of possibility of earning money with a very low degree of actual human effort. When we look at things like this, one of the questions we get asked are, well, how do I get around this? What's interesting that we find is recently this is being mixed with an account takeover attack. That's where somebody loses control over their home email, their work email, their social media, and it allows the attacker to not only do this phishing attack, but actually do it from a account that's been compromised, And that lets them actually bypass almost all of your traditional gateway security. So if you've got something like Mimecast, or if you've got something out in the on a SMTP gateway, for example, when this is mixed with an account takeover, it really is going to bypass that. So the next generation of security that will help against that are really two different things. One is API-based cloud app security, so that's where you get rid of your mail gateway, and everything is being done at an API level behind the scenes. And that way, if someone is sending the email and it's actually a perfect internal email because they've compromised the account, the things like Cloud App Security can still see that and stop that and prevent you from downloading a malware or falling victim to it. The other piece that we like to say here is it's time to reassess those security programs to reach an acceptable risk level. I say that because we have gotten actually a large uptick in calls specifically on these fraud attacks, and almost in all of them, the executive teams have been excluded from security policies. And so what that means is the people who need the most protection are getting the least protection. And so the folks who have the most access, are the most critical, and can do the most damage are basically unfettered on the internet. That's a philosophy that we've preached against quite a bit, and it very much has to change, especially given the circumstances we're in right now. I would hazard to say that pretty much all of the calls that we've gotten over the last week and a half related to this turned out to be the case where executives were excluded from what really should be standard basic level security. Bypassing your security. So anyone who's heard me talk in the past, I've always harped on decrypting SSL, OpenDNS, hardening your firewalls and content filter, and getting ready to migrate to next-gen AV. So here's a really good reason why. So there was a recent study that basically showed 3/4 of all phishing sites are using SSL protection. So what that means is most security in between the PC and the bad guy is encrypted. You are basically blind if you are not decrypting SSL. And so by hardening your firewall, by using OpenDNS, these things are all mitigating. And then at the end of that mitigation roadmap, you have decrypting SSL, which is, of course, the hardest. It's really the only thing that you can do about this issue. And these guys call it a business email compromise. We call it an account takeover. But basically around the world, they are also seeing a big increase in this. And executives are absolutely the target. And when we say executives, what we also have to add to that list is anybody in the money handling chain. So that's accounts payable, that's accounts receivable, that is anyone who can do an ACH wire transfer. They're all potential targets here. It is really important to understand that the way these frauds work, it's not just about you. Sometimes they hack you in order to steal money from other people. Sometimes they hack other people to steal money from you. Sometimes they hack you to steal money from yourself. So it can happen in all three of those directions. And so we have to be very careful about it. The other thing that happens in accordance with this is an increased number of zero-day PDFs that are coming from these encrypted channels. So the phishing attack has an encrypted channel that then goes and picks up a new malware. So all of these things are getting together, and because everyone is working from home, the potential risk is a lot higher. We're seeing a marked increase in the laxity of attention people are paying right now to what would normally be caught as a security issue when everyone's in the office is kind of being ignored now that everyone's working from home. Some of it is just everything looks different, feels different, behaves different, and so they've kind of lost that linkage between what do they need to get done and how is everything operating and what is abnormal. So we have to look at reinforcing that. But this is a good example that, to me, we already have an issue where 70–80% of the stuff on the internet is encrypted, and then we add to it that specifically on the phishing side, they are now paying for SSL certs to pull this off. You're talking about a real monetary focused basically cyber criminal gang, and we all have to be aware of that and start engaging in these mitigating techniques to start moving past kind of traditional anti-spam and traditional antivirus to protect ourselves from it. So this is my favorite thing that I've gotten so far this week, mostly because the number of replies we get from folks that say, it's okay, my executive doesn't need to be secured, they're on a Mac. So over the last week, Apple released over 30 security patches. Pretty much every flavor, whether it be iPads, iPhones, Mac OS, Safari itself, they've all got issues. Issues where they can execute code while just surfing a website and not clicking on anything. Code can be executed as a kernel mode driver, basically, and they can even pull data out of restricted memory. What's even worse about this is the last 27 patches that Mac OS released over the last couple of weeks, 6 actually added new bugs that allow for arbitrary code execution. So I talk about it a lot, but droids are not safe. Mac is not safe. Everybody at this point needs to be treated as a potential endpoint to secure and an endpoint that can be targeted. Decade or two ago, it used to be nobody really worried about vulnerabilities or malware for Macs because there weren't enough Macs in the business world for it to matter. When on a business point of view, if a Mac, really only accounts for 2 to 3% of the whole population of devices, and most of those ended up being in schools and academic locations where there wasn't much money to steal, there was really no incentive to create malwares. Now that we've got executives running around with iPads and iPhones and Macs are becoming more prevalent, there's a financial incentive to it. And as a result, we see these security patches rolling out faster and faster because it's a really good target. We've also seen where Macs are being compromised, as is things like CentOS Linux are being compromised with the sole goal of then turning around and hacking other Microsoft systems. So for example, the RDP hack that we were talking about yesterday, one of the ways that that's being utilized is to hack an unpatched CentOS box or a Macintosh and then use that as your jump point so that you don't really mess with the Mac, you just use the Mac to get to the rest of the environment. And so we see that continuing to happen over the last few weeks as well. So our top 3 calls. From last week, we still have the issue of lots of people didn't really plan for the amount of licenses that they need. We still have distributors with delays falling behind. So this is actually a pretty prevalent issue still. Online resellers are still getting more and more risky. We've run into actually a couple this week where people attempted to buy things from an online reseller that never got delivered because it doesn't take much effort to pop open a website store and take people's credit cards and take people's money. So definitely something to be very, very leery of, especially if it's not an online retailer that you traditionally do business with. Hijacked email threads and fraud attacks. This definitely has gone up. The more people that have been successfully transitioned to working from home and on the VPN, we've been seeing this go up quite severely. We've also seen a couple of situations where folks are being exempted from MFA for speed, and that's almost instantly resulted in one of these fraud attacks coming through. The real thing that's needed for protection there, it's going to be your multi-factor with conditional access. That is the traditional requirement. Conditional access is for people, of course, who are on the Microsoft or the Google G Suite, whereas MFA is for anyone, whether it's on-prem or off-prem. And then the account takeover portion of Cloud App Security. That's also going to be pretty critical for preventing that hijack. We do a lot of auditing here. If people are wondering who is most commonly attacking, what we see from an online email hijack. It's typically South Africa right now, France, and Belgium, and Amsterdam. So those are typically where we're seeing it come from. I know everyone's always talking about Russia and China, but when it comes to these fraud attacks, that's actually the most common geolocation that we find hitting people, which is not to say it doesn't come from the other countries as well. It's just that typically, when a country gets good at something, or when a criminal element gets good at something, they focus on it. So it's not surprising that we see different types of attacks coming from different geolocations. And when we talk about geo-IP blocking, that's where we really have to get into, okay, are we really doing a business with North Africa? And if not, do we really want to be accepting, emails from there? It's definitely in this current kind of hectic stage that everyone's in with the coronavirus. We just need to make sure that that gets ratcheted up in terms of security or lack of trust in order to keep everything safe. We're also seeing a pretty big uptick in fake executive emails with malware links and PDFs. We're not seeing much in terms of Office documents. In fact, we've seen pretty much no interesting new Office documents. And when I say interesting, I mean we're ignoring the stuff that every spam filter on Earth is already cleansing, right? So if we rule out that 80% of the garbage and just concentrate on the 20% that's interesting, new, different, difficult, it's more and more we're seeing malware links to encrypted sites and PDFs. The malware links to encrypted sites are also often going to things like Box, Google Drive, OneDrive, Dropbox, things like that, which a lot of people are often whitelisting from their security for ease of employee use. Definitely want to stop that because that is a prime location. Those public drives or even those personal shares are being spun up, used for serving out malware, and then shut down before they can get a reputation or anything like that. Best protection on those pieces are going to be an API-based CAS to get that 0-day sandboxing capability, which basically means if the executive email is faked because the account was taken over, when they email it to the accounting department or to IT or to all employees, or worse than that, to your customers, that's going to be inside. And a lot of the old school security is not doing an inside to inside protection or an inside to outside protection. And so those are definitely things that we have to be concerned about because we're seeing them across the business contacts that we have and that call us. We're seeing this escalate pretty quickly. And to match with that, next-gen AV, we've been talking about it for about a year. It's becoming more and more important that people migrate to some kind of next-gen, multiple sandboxes, and definitely memory inspection. Those are all pretty critical right now. Why they're picking on PDFs and malware links versus Office documents. I think for me personally, we've seen that Office documents have been picked on so much that there's a lot of good security to tear them apart. But PDFs were kind of treated as quote unquote images, so they weren't really dealt with. There is a vulnerability with Microsoft right now called the Adobe Type Manager, and we've had people ask if that's related to this PDF issue. They actually have nothing to do with each other. And even though the vulnerability is called Adobe Type Manager, it's actually part of Windows that deals with font control and has nothing to do with Adobe. So uninstalling Adobe or anything like that is not relevant to that vulnerability, as a side note. So our predicted work from home concerns. Do employees know how to work from home, processes and habits? Still an issue. Still getting lots of calls. I'd say over this week, the calls are, now that people are starting to get in, we're getting questions of, well, can they print? Can they play with paper? Can they have multiple monitors? And then how does that work? All of these questions are eating more and more bandwidth, but then also becoming more and more dangerous from a potential compliance point of view. One of the things that we recommend there is at this point, the business should be reminding people what compliance is. And if you've got a compliance officer, they should be sending out statements on, what should and shouldn't be printed while working from home, versus it being solely an IT connectivity issue that's being discussed. We are seeing the issue where IT was being overrun starting to decline. But at the same token, what we're looking at is a lot of folks kind of boosting how many users can get in. So there's been a little bit of a lag. So our impression is that anyone who's starting to feel comfortable should begin to feel uncomfortable, because over the next week or two, we think that's going to rubber band back. Just based on the patterns that we're seeing, and there's going to be another overburdening of IT, just dealing with these people who don't traditionally work from home. The next one I had predicted was is anyone actually doing work? Especially now that kids in a lot of areas have an extended education from home issue arising. This really hasn't hit yet. We've got some clients that we deal with who were mostly distributed workforce already. They're getting into trying to figure out whether people are efficient, productive, idle when they're at home. So, if we take them as the early warning, then I would say, we're probably 2 or 3 weeks out from that question really getting forced. If we're lucky, then we're going to see, potentially some loosening of the business restrictions before then. But I know in our area, schools basically closed until summer. So if that is prevalent elsewhere, even if the business restrictions to working get lightened, we might all have a childcare issue that then needs to be addressed, which leads to people working from home longer than we would like. Also. And so 2 new concerns that we wanted to bring up. Again, fraud-based email hijacking going through the roof. If we might typically see one of those attacks in a month, we already went to one of those a week, and now we're already in multiple of those per week. If we kind of keep that pattern, you're really talking about a logarithmic growth in that area. And then the same issue with account takeover attacks resulting in basically fake executives sending internal and external malware. Sometimes we get the question that says, well, if they're sending it externally, it should be the other person's job to go block it. Keep in mind, you've got a reputation risk there, not just an IT risk, but a business reputation risk. You could be flagged as not just a spammer, but a malware generator, at which point your entire IP block can be blacklisted and offline. You could be considered a toxic domain, at which case your website can go offline. And as everyone is working more and more on remote business and remote B2B and B2C, you can't really afford to have those reputation risks turn you dark, right? You can't really afford to have that lack of trust right now, because it's a pretty low trust environment as we speak. So we really just need to make sure that folks understand it's not just about protecting you, it's making sure that you can't be used against anyone else, and you've got to look at it from those 2 different points of view. Otherwise, you might end up with never getting a malware, but no one wants to do business with you because they keep getting malware from you. We do have to keep in mind that as we get to the point where malware becomes more and more a criminal enterprise, the whole goal in a criminal enterprise is to find a weak spot and to use that weak spot for as long as possible before severing that relationship, let's say. And that's one of the reasons why people don't know that they've been subverted, or people don't know that they've got a malware running around. These things are built to be quiet and either slowly gather information to then use against you when they're done gathering it, or they find a weak spot and then use that weak spot to attack strong locations with a better return on investment in terms of dollars. So you definitely have to take both approaches in terms of security of what you're sending out to people as much as what you're allowing in. Next piece here I like is not reacting to fear. So we've gotten maybe about 4 of these that all look almost exactly the same. Uh, and basically, with all of the uncertainty right now, there's a lot of fear-related spam or sales going on. So these messages are coming either from spammers or just sales departments that, I don't know about you, but I really wouldn't want to deal with if this is the type of tactic that they're going to want to use. But we've seen basically a similar pattern for a couple of businesses where someone sends an email like we have on the screen that says, I found vulnerabilities, I'm here to help you out, blah, blah, blah. Well, so first of all, nothing on the internet's free. That's never been true, never will be true. Someone's getting paid somehow. Same thing is true here. Now, we've seen it where it is just a sales technique that people are using, but we've also seen it where they're trying to get data so that they can progress an attack that's already in process. And so that's really dangerous because people are seeing this and they're scared, so they're replying, assuming that let's hope this quote unquote researcher is a good guy, and by talking with this good guy, I'm going to be safer. And so they're really preying on that fear. And so at best, it's a disreputable sales tactic being used. At worst, it is either the start or the escalation of an existing attack. It's an easy way to gather more info so that they can then use the compromised machine they have to get further and deeper in the environment while turning less and less alarms on. And so either way, our opinion is when you get these, you should ignore it. You need to do your own research, do your own vulnerability scans, and really focus on your own security roadmap and not really respond to this style of email. We've seen it come from fake company domains. The scariest ones are where we identified that it came from basically a fake website with a fake domain that really looked like it was a researcher, but we were able to drill it down that it was really fake all the way across. And then on the sales side, a lot of these are coming from things like Gmail or Office 365, and it looks like a commission-only sales rep working from home. But those things should make you nervous as well. A true researcher emailing people off Gmail, it's not likely. It doesn't make, let's say, good sense that this would be a good business-to-business email to respond to. So a few tips that we've got. So one, we're going to say again, people patching before they leave the office, really important here. One of the other things to bring up is I've seen where people are suspending patch management. I'm going to flag that that's a pretty bad idea. We've already seen some conflicts where not doing patches, but then you have some user apps that automatically patch when they're loaded, resulting in blue screens. So you don't really want to be the IT department that's got a whole bunch of machines blue screening. And of course, users are going to go back to their management and say, oh, I couldn't work, my machine blue screened, and IT doesn't know why. We've already gotten calls like that where people are asking for help. And it's a bad situation to be in because, the business looks at IT and says, well, what the heck? You can't even, get our users working. They're saying it's your reason they can't be productive. And so, we started that bullet by saying that before they get released to work from home, you should have it. Now that they are at home, you need to make sure you've got some kind of process in place that's still patching them. And if you haven't considered it or looked at it, now's the time. Start looking at how you're going to keep those boxes patched. Microsoft did release an update saying they will basically change the nature of how they're doing patches during this pandemic. They're actually not going to release any updates that are not related to a security update over the next couple of weeks in order to help make that easier for folks. Firefox, I believe, is doing the same thing. There's some other vendors doing the same thing. Their goal is to make it easier for you guys, but definitely I would recommend that someone get tasked with how you're going to keep these machines up to date out in the wild. Next piece here that we found, last week we did notice there was a progression where people were still basically, quote unquote, working from home from personal devices, or basically doing email from their phone and not truly working. They were just doing email and doing phone calls. And so what we're seeing is, once again, we've gotten another rush of people who now can't avoid VPNing in because they have to get to files or they have to get to systems. They can't put it off anymore. They're having issues with client version mismatches and things like that. So that's another piece to consider. Third bullet we've already talked about quite a few times in terms of ACH wire transfer fraud. And licensing still continues to be a pretty decent issue that people are battling with. One of the things that we found for licensing is confusion on named users versus concurrent connections. Definitely something I'd recommend checking into. We've gotten calls for conflicts of that, where people are now overbuying licenses because they're trying to get named users, but they have multiple shifts and they really didn't need to buy double the amount of licenses. So definitely something to think about there is making sure whatever products you're using, that you validate whether it's a named user or a concurrent connection. Most of the VPNs we deal with here are all concurrent connections, so you don't need licenses per named user. But that's another thing that we've been running into lately. So the best bang for your buck. So looking at this based on what we're tracking as issues, cloud app security definitely in our current situation, a good bang for your buck. You can potentially look at switching costs. Sometimes we're getting asked the question of how can I get more value out of the security, and people will talk about 3 or 4 different gateway-based security products they're using. You might have the ability to say, okay, we can't spend more money, but perhaps we can go trash some of these systems that are becoming ineffective and migrate them to cloud app security, which at least double dips with takeover protection as well as the anti-spam and malware and zero-day protection. So that would be a good bang for your buck item. Next-gen antivirus, that's because everyone is distributed, that's kind of a focus of ours. The Cloud App Security above does deal with completely uncontrolled devices. So iPads, for example, hitting SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, all that kind of good stuff can be fixed with Cloud App Security. Next-Gen AV is, of course, only for controlled systems, so your domain systems and your workstations and laptops. Biggest issue with that is almost always you're going to have a cost increase over traditional antivirus, but the net benefit of that in this distributed environment, as Next-Gen AV will get you more memory level security versus just scanning file level security, makes that an important piece. OpenDNS, we're seeing a lot of good activity with. The follow me protection on that is quite useful, especially with split tunnel VPNs. We have seen it actually block a number of new attacks this week that were coming from traditionally whitelisted systems such as SharePoint and Teams shares coming from third parties. And so that was really good because basically, even though everyone's using Office 365, OpenDNS was able to go out and pick out that one server that happened to be hosting malware and block access to it while allowing all the rest of SharePoint to work. So that was a really useful piece. And what we like about it is OpenDNS and Next-Gen AV and Cloud App Security, they all work completely differently. So they all work from a different point of view. And so you don't get clashing. Clashing is not helpful right now. We've got one client that's currently running a mishmash of, they've got Malwarebytes, they've got a antivirus on there that I believe is Symantec, and then they're trying to do something with Carbon Black all at the same time. And now that everyone is working from home, these things are clashing constantly. Users are having a hard time working, and it's basically 3 different levels of or layers of application that all do 99% the same exact thing, the same exact way at the same exact time. Really don't want that. So for them, we're working through how to tear out that stuff so they just end up with one antivirus and have security products that work differently offsetting it versus trying to basically do the same thing 3 times over and then hope performance is good. And then the last good bang for your buck is just prepping for that activity tracking solution. So, when the business comes back and it says, I need to know if people are being useful or not, I need to know if they're being productive or not. As IT, you guys can help facilitate that. There's good solutions out there that don't pose too much of a security risk. Anything that's overly cheap or free is going to be a security risk. We found some of them are being hosted out in China. And so when you think about it, something that's monitoring the activity of what your machine's doing being hosted out of China just sounds bad saying it out loud because it pretty much is bad. So if you do one of those solutions, you do want to make sure that you know where your data is, how it transmits, who can access it, and what security goes around it. But we're seeing that as a pretty useful tool during this time as well.